Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Unbashful. I, of course, am your host, Nicholas Doucette. I want to thank you for stopping by here today. I hope all of you had a very healthy and happy holiday season. And with that being said, I'm going to be doing my ranking of the year. And instead of doing the traditional format that I see across YouTube of doing the 10 best versus the 10 worst, I figured I would just condense it down to ranking all 30 movies I watched that came out this year. So we're going to start from obviously 30 and we're going to progressively make our way to number 1. I just think that I prefer to do that anyways, and I think I'd rather watch that because, not to, screw on anyone that wants to do those top 10s and whatnot. I enjoy doing them myself. But I feel like I want to try and do something a little bit different. And this certainly has been done before by guys like Sean Chandler and other YouTubers as well. I just think this is more fun. So let's kick it off with number 30. So coming in at number 30 is Morbius. And this film has been the butt of jokes for the entire year, ever since it came out in, I think it was originally supposed to come out in January, and then it came out in April. This film fell victim to the pandemic. If there was a movie that got screwed over by the pandemic, which a lot of movies did, I think Morbius felt the most hardship out of all films that struggled and that came out during the pandemic era. I mean, when you delay a movie so many times, inevitably you're going to lose some interest from the audience. And I think that's a big reason as to what happened. Of course, the movie's just bad. Let's just call it what it is. It's not a good film. But beyond that, there was a lot of people that were quite excited to see this, myself included. I saw Venom. Didn't love those films, but I enjoyed them. And I enjoyed them quite a bit. The first one more so than Venom Let There Be Carnage. But I thought they were fun, and I could tell that Sony was trying to build their own cinematic universe surrounding Spider-Man because the character is so rich, and there are so many characters in that world just itself. So it makes sense, and I found out that Morbius is going to be that next entry in the cinematic universe. I'm not very familiar with the character, but I just the base level information I know. He's a vampire. He's set in the Spider-Man world. That to me is enough. That's exciting to me. That's intriguing. And I feel like this film had a lot of potential, but there were so many conflicting ideas, studio interference, and of course the last minute bait and switch that Sony did when they originally put out the trailers, as I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with what I'm about to talk about. All the trailers leading up to this film's inevitable release were teasing and connecting the dots to the connection between Morbius and Spider-Man and just the world in general. And then if you keep up with this kind of thing, if you keep up with, the film Twitter, whatnot, you found out shortly before the film's release that the studio decided to completely cut any references to Spider-Man and, of course, cut the infamous shot in one of the trailers showing Spider-Man on, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man spray painted on a wall. That was completely cut from the film. The only Spider-Man connection and reference was a few shots of the Daily Bugle logo and, like a newsprint or like a billboard. And of course, the terrible end credit scene with Michael Keaton that completely contradicted the logic and the spell that was established in Spider-Man No Way Home. So beyond that, there's a couple things here. Most notably for me, I wrote down in my notes, I think the film was really held back by its PG-13 rating. Specifically, there was a lot of fight scenes where you see Morbius, slashing and dashing and slicing people's necks open, but it would quickly cut shortly after. It would never show the follow-up damage as to what actually happened to those people that he inflicted the violence on. You would never see their neck. The most you would see is them shortly after, and then their hands would be covering the neck. So you would never see any blood squibs or anything like that. And I understand that there's clever ways you could work around that in a PG-13 film, but I just don't think they did it correctly. Not to mention, this is a vampire, okay? So inherently, blood is deeply connected to a vampire. That's how they function, right? We all know that. We understand that. And they tried to use, with the PG-13 rating, they tried to dance around that by using this artificial blue blood, and I just don't think it worked at all. So I think they were kind of prohibited to really go all out with this film, and I could tell that they wanted to, because for all it's worth, while this movie isn't good, you could see, especially in some of the action scenes, that there was potential. That could have been really cool had had they had the studio greenlight maybe a 14A rating, if that's even still a thing. That might just be exclusive to Canada, but yeah, I think the PG-13 rating really held this film back, and then I think the film just felt out of time. Out of this time specifically, I think this belongs more in like the early 2000s. I think if this film came out in that era of films like Blade, films like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, I think this would have really fit in to that universe. Excuse me, I'm getting a phone call. This just did not feel like it, and I'm not saying it needs to borrow tropes and stuff like that from current comic book movies, but it definitely didn't feel like it was made for 2022. And then lastly, just of my sort of criticisms of the film, I think the writing and the direction was probably the biggest disappointment for me, because you can make up for things like I said, the action and being held back by the PG-13 rating. You can make up for that with good acting and good dialogue. And the thing is, you have a film that has Academy Award-winning actors like Jared Leto. You have Matt Smith. He's a great actor. You have Jared Harris. If any of you have seen the HBO limited series about Chernobyl, that was my introduction to Jared Harris, and he is a phenomenal actor. And these actors they weren't able to take ownership of their characters, of their performance, because they were held back by bad writing and, quite frankly, bad direction. So, and what I'm going to do with the rest of this list, so that's pretty much all my criticisms of Morbius, but what I'm going to do is each film I go through, up until I'm in like my top 15, and I'm talking about the films that I loved, I'm always going to point out one highlight. I'm always going to try and search for at least one silver lining, even in the bad films that I'm going to talk about for basically 30 through 20. And I guess even 30 through like to 17. So each one of these films, I'm going to end this segment before I move on to the next with a highlight. And for me, the highlight was in this film was when Jared Leto was in vampire form. I thought the visual effects looked pretty good. I think the actual design of his face and how his face contorted once he was actually transitioning from his normal human form to vampire form, I thought that looked really cool. So if there's one highlight I can give this film, I would say it's the visual effect in regards to Jared Leto's character and even to Matt Smith's character. So now we're going to move on to number 29. So number 29 on the list is Smile. Now, funny story about this film. I live in Toronto, and my dad was going to see Iron Maiden, which is like a rock band. He was going to go see them in Hamilton, and he needed somebody to be a designated driver for him, and because my dad was going to have a few beers. So I drove him, and I drop him off at the hotel, and now at this point I'm on my own. I have a couple hours to kill, more like 3, and I've never been to Hamilton, so I'm not familiar with the city. I don't know anybody there. And I just looked at the movie theater. I went to see what was playing. And there was really nothing at that time. I can't even remember what time this was. But nonetheless, Smile was the only movie at the time that seemed intriguing enough for me to go watch while my dad was, enjoying his concert. So I saw it, and I was already familiar with like the premise and the plot. I'd seen the trailers. The movie didn't look all that interesting to me, but I thought, what the fuck? Got nothing else to do. I'll go watch it. And I didn't like this movie. I didn't like it. I didn't dislike it as much as I disliked Morbius. But the thing is, this film was just bad. And aside from Sosie Bacon, who, by the way, if I mispronounce your name, I apologize. But aside from her, she's the lead actress of the film. I feel like the performances from the rest of the cast weren't very convincing, especially the husband character. Now, a lot of times, you could attribute bad acting to multiple things. It could be to the writing, or it could just solely be on the performer itself. And I know that some of these other actors, they've been in other things. Like, for example, the actor who played Kumar in the Harold and Kumar films, I hadn't seen him in forever. He was in this film. Once again, he's not necessarily a bad actor, but I just couldn't buy in to him. Although most of the time I'm able to watch a film And if there is an actor that's in the film that was, widely recognized and remembered for a specific character, most of the time I'm usually able to suspend that disbelief and differentiate from their past roles. But I just didn't think the acting was convincing enough, and very specifically with Sosie Bacon's husband in the film. I just didn't think he was quite compelling. And he, like I said, he's not a bad actor. I know he plays the A-Train character in The Boys, and I know that show has a huge audience and whatnot. So, and I mean, who am I even to say bad acting? I mean, at the end of the day, I'm trying to be an actor myself, and I haven't done shit. But as more from a critic perspective, that's just how I noticed it. And moving on here to some other things, the film just simply wasn't scary. I think the number one job of a horror film is to, you're not always going to terrify viewers. And some people are more cynical than others, so they'll go in preemptively just telling themselves that this is not going to scare me. I go into these films with a pretty open mind. I hope to be scared. That's the whole point of seeing a horror film. You're going for that thrill factor, and I just didn't get that with this film at all. In fact, more times than not, when the film was attempting to make me scared in those moments of intensity, I actually found it more funny and cheesy than anything. And similar to Morbius, this film felt very dated. It didn't feel like it should have come out in 2022. It felt like it belonged in that sort of Scream era. Now, I know there's still Scream movies coming out, but I mean when Scream was at the height of its prowess, and when you had all those actors in the film and it was the most popular thing in pop culture. It was in the zeitgeist. And, the new one is certainly popular. I know a lot of people, like this one YouTuber I watched, 3C Films, loves the Scream franchise. So there's obviously still a following for it, but I'm getting away from my point. But yeah, once similar to Morbius, I feel like this film didn't belong in 2022, considering where we're at from a cinema perspective. Now, like this film, I've talked to a lot of people that like it, and some of my friends like it, and they'll explain why, and I can understand. But for me personally, I just didn't think the writing was very good, even the special effects, and the moments where, like I said, the moments where I was supposed to be scared when the characters were smiling. For example, that first exchange because essentially the plot of this film is that these characters have almost this infectious cancer within them, and when they smile at somebody without the person being smiled at realizing it, they're now basically that's the wrong word. They're basically catching this infection, this cancer that this person had, and it gets passed on from one to another. And when it gets passed on to another person, the previous, holder of it dies. I kind of was all over the place explaining that. But so the moments where characters are smiling and doing this whole MacGuffin of what the film is, I just couldn't take it serious, to be quite frank with you. Now, that's pretty much all my critical thoughts about Smile, but if I were to give this film a highlight, it's going to go to Sosie Bacon's performance. I think she did as good as a job as she could have, and I think she's a really, really good actress. So now let's move on to number 28. So clocking in at number 28 is going to be Fantastic Beasts and the Secrets of Dumbledore. Now, my relationship to the Harry Potter franchise is I grew up with those films. They have a very special place in my heart, and I love them. There isn't a single entry in the Harry Potter franchise that I disliked. I like some, entries more than others. But once the saga wrapped with the Deathly Hallows Part 1 and 2, I thought it was a nice conclusion. And of course, Harry Potter being as lucrative as it is, we have to understand that this is a business. They're never just going to completely retire an IP. They'll do spin-offs, and, we're all familiar with that model. And this is no different with the Fantastic Beasts films. Now, my relationship to this franchise is I've liked these films for what they are. They're serviceable, but they've never wowed me. And I'd say this is probably my least favorite out of the three. I just found this film to be simply just boring. If I just put it bluntly, I was bored. And I think I felt the runtime dragging a lot. I was constantly checking my watch, checking the time, and there are some redeeming qualities. Like, I would say, aside from Jude Law, who played a young Albus Dumbledore, who we saw introduced in the second film, and aside from him and aside from Dan Fogler, who plays Jacob Kowalski, I just don't think any of the characters are interesting or memorable. And yeah, I'm talking about the main protagonist. I can't remember the actor's name. I can't even remember the character's name. I'm drawing a blank. That just goes to show how uninteresting they are. And there's just nothing, like, there's nothing that sticks with me after I leave the theater. I'm not thinking about these characters. Aside from Jude Law, I think he does a nice young Albus Dumbledore. He has the class. He has this sort of flamboyant poise that the older Dumbledore that we obviously know and love. And I think Dan Fogler just brings a sense of levity that's needed in that film, in those films in general, because I think the first thing that really comes to my mind is just bland. That's just really how I feel about these films. I like the first one. I'd still probably say the first one is my favorite, but these films all just kind of blend together in a way, and they're all just kind of bland. And I think without Dan Fogler, I don't think I'd even watch these films at all, to be honest with you, after the first one, because his character, obviously he's a muggle, and he brings that sort of duality between the the wizarding world, and he brings the insight to someone who's been on the ground and who's lived with normal everyday society, so he has that point of reference from both sides. And I just think he's funny, he's charismatic, and I think that lacks in some of the other characters. So a lot of you will probably feel different. I know some of my friends really enjoyed this film. And to point out the one highlight, I would say it was revisiting Hogwarts and revisiting Hogmeats and that whole community. And it definitely looked different, but, architecturally speaking, it was the Hogmeats and it was the Hogwarts that we know and love. And another big problem for me in this film was Grindelwald. Mads Mikkelsen is a great actor. I'm not trying to criticize his performance. This more has to do with the behind the scenes and the production. So I'm not putting the load of blame on Mads Mikkelsen. He did a job. He did what he had to do. But the problem for me is, I don't think there's ever been, we see actors and we see characters getting recast all the time. I mean, just look at the Batman character. It's been played by several different actors over the years. And obviously many other superheroes and IPs have that as well. But in one franchise, meaning one story, there's multiple sequels, I don't think within one franchise, within one main story, I don't think we've ever seen a character get recast as many times as we've seen the Grindelwald character. Of course, it was played by Colin Farrell in the first film, then Johnny Depp, and of course all the court business was happening, that was why he was recast. That makes sense. And then we have Mads Mikkelsen. And of course, as an actor stepping into a character that was already previously played by another actor, you want to find things that will distinct yourselves from that previous performance. But that's usually if the character is being rebooted and restarted, right? Look at Robert Pattinson. He's clearly a different Bruce Wayne from Christian Bale. But the difference with this is that, as I mentioned, this is not a reboot. This is a continuation of a character that audiences have been following for two other entries. So it doesn't really leave the actor a lot of room to try and bring some of his own sort of flair to the character. He has to maintain some of the familiarities that the other actors had inhabited. So what the problem was, and it's a very hard pill to swallow when you're these new actors stepping in, because it almost created it was the same character, Grindelwald, but each film it was really an entirely new Grindelwald. It wasn't the same. And I think for me, as I mentioned, I have more than enough capability of suspending disbelief. But when a character has been recasted 3 times now, and if they do a 4th film, God forbid, knock on wood, Mads Mikkelsen sticks around, because if they recast a 4th time, I just don't think I'm going to watch it personally. So, yeah. So like I said, for me, the highlight of this film was the nostalgia, essentially. So now let's move on to number 27. Clocking in at number 27, we have Pixar's Lightyear. I am a huge fan of of the Toy Story franchise. I was born in 2000, so I grew up right along when those films were coming out, when they were at their magnum opus. And the idea of a Lightyear film, a spin-off about that character, I've always found that very interesting, and I've never understood why they hadn't ever really done that. Now, when, details were coming out about the film, a lot of people were upset, and a lot of people just couldn't wrap their head around the idea of this film. So it's not about the toy, it's about the character from which the toy is being merchandised for. To me, that sounds very, very simple. But for a lot of people, they just couldn't figure that out. They were like, why are you doing that? Why don't you just make a movie about the toy? And for me, that was never a problem. In fact, that's the thing that actually intrigued me the most. It's like, look at the real world. You have, let's say you have an Iron Man toy. You make an Iron Man movie, which obviously they've done, but that's just my example. So the idea sounded intriguing, and I watched some YouTubers that attended CinemaCon, and some of them said that, the first 20 minutes were shown, and it was absolutely insane, and it might even be a best picture contender, and that's a lot of talk. I mean, that's some real business right there. So I had very high expectations heading into this film, and I liked the first hour, but ultimately I think the execution of this film failed pretty badly, and I didn't like the twist at the end. I can't remember the name of the antagonist, but they established it in the Toy Story films that Buzz has this arch nemesis, and you guys probably know what I'm talking. He's like the big robotic person, and in this, it's just a older version of Buzz. I just felt that was very lazy writing for that to be the ultimate conclusion. It just makes things feel inconsequential. And yeah, I don't know. I just think this film missed the mark. I think it had a lot of potential, and I just think it just didn't raise to it. And I had no problem with Chris Evans being the voice actor. A lot of people complain that it should have been Tim Allen and whatnot. But once again, they're making that distinction because this is not a film of the toy walking around in Andy's room. This is about the IP and the character for which the toy is merchandised about or derivative or derived from, whatever. So that for me was no problem, and that transitions us nicely to the highlight. The highlight of this film for me was Chris Evans' performance and his voice acting. So not a great film, and that clocks in at number 27. Now let's move on to number 26. So number 26, I have Amsterdam, which really disappointed to have it this low on the list. Myself and a lot of people were really excited for this, not only just for the actors in front of the camera, but for the people operating everything behind the camera, specifically David O. Russell. Now, David O. Russell, his reputation precedes him. And look, just because this film wasn't very good, it wasn't his best entry, that does not take away from how talented and world-class of a filmmaker he is, and I'm sure he's going to remind us within the next couple of years with a new film that he'll make. So I haven't lost faith in David O. Russell. For those of you who don't know who David O. Russell is, he directed The Fighter, he directed Silver Linings Playbook, he directed, I'm drawing a blank, I can't remember, American Hustle, and many other films. So he's a great director, Academy, nominee, and I have no worry that he'll follow this up with a good film. But getting back to this, I just think the film was too convoluted. There's too many characters, and there are many ways. You can do an ensemble correctly, and he's done an ensemble very, very well with American Hustle. That film had Bradley Cooper, Christian Bale, Amy Adams, and so on. And this film had Christian Bale as well. And I would probably say Christian Bale is the highlight. I think he played the most interesting character. Now, the film basically centers around this trio of Margot Robbie, John David Washington, and Christian Bale, and they all served roles in the World War, and they made a pact to essentially stick together and, not lose touch and whatnot. And I also just didn't really feel the chemistry between them as well. That's another thing. I just didn't get that chemistry between them specifically. That was just me. But I think Christian Bale's character was the most intriguing. He, after the war, he became this doctor that would create prosthetics that would look as human-like as possible, because of course with a lot of these guys that are missing limbs or even missing parts of their face, it can be embarrassing and it could be daunting to wander out to society because they're afraid of, people looking at them weird and whatnot. And he would basically create these prosthetic parts to the body that would look as unnoticeable as possible. And yeah, like I said, it's not a terrible film, but I just think it was far too long. I didn't feel engaged as an audience member, and I just kind of got bored at times. The performances were fine. You have amazing actors. I love John David Washington. I for one am a huge fan of Tenet. It's not my favorite Christopher Nolan film, but I like it a lot compared to a lot of other people that I've talked to who don't. A lot of people have told me Tenet is convoluted as well, and that's a whole argument for another day. But I like Margot Robbie. She's in Babylon, which is on this list. Spoiler alert. We'll talk about that later. So there's no problem with the actors. Yeah, I mean, Robert De Niro's in this. Michael Shannon. I'm probably gonna forget some others. Chris Rock. I think Taylor Swift was in the movie for a couple of minutes. So it's a huge ensemble. I just feel like the dots didn't connect the way they were intended to. So as I mentioned, the highlight for me is Christian Bale's performance. Let's move on to number 25. Coming in at number 25 is a Netflix original film called Spiderhead, directed by Joseph Kosinski, who directed Top Gun. And once again, spoiler alert, Top Gun is on this list. Obviously, I watched it, so we'll talk about that later. This film was not Joseph Kosinski's greatest entry. Now, Joseph Kosinski directed Oblivion. Of course, he directed Top Gun Maverick, which is more than likely going to get a Best Picture nomination and many other Oscar nominations. So, talented director. I just think this film missed the mark. Interesting plot, very Black Mirror-esque. You have these prisoners that volunteer to be test subjects in this remote island facility in exchange for a more comfortable living environment while they serve their sentence. So that has been kind of done before, but I'm always interested to see different takes and different interpretations of that plot. And for me, Chris Hemsworth, yeah. Excuse me. I got a burp choked up in my throat, but I don't want to do it in the mic. Chris Hemsworth is an awesome actor. I love him. I love him as Thor. I love him in many other films. I actually don't think people give him enough credit for him and his range as an actor. But I feel like he was miscast for this role as this sort of like sociopathic, evil scientist who's, is tricking people into thinking that everything's going to be okay. I think I would have liked, as a producer, I think I would have kind of leaned into somebody a little bit different personally. That's not to say he had a bad performance, but I just think it's just something about it that for me just didn't really work. I can't really put my thumb on it, but for those of you who watched the film, you might agree with me or you might not. Miles Teller was fine. I think he was great as the lead protagonist of this film. But for me, I just think that it started to become a little bit too predictable, almost right off the jump. We know that there's a mystery. We know that things aren't going to go as planned. We know that this drug that they're trying is in that down to it's going to go bad for somebody. Like, we know that, but I think it was just a little bit too predictable, and kind of just was a little bit too long as well. That's a trend you're seeing in a lot of these films, and the thing about a movie is length is really not, I don't know how to properly explain this. Length doesn't have to be an issue. I have no problem with a movie being 3 hours if it's done right, if it's written well, if there aren't wasted moments, right? We have character development while we are also furthering the plot, right? So you can have a 3-hour film and make it feel like a 2-hour film. You can have a 2-hour film and make it feel like a 4-hour film. You can have an hour and a half film and have it feel like an hour and a half film. You see what I'm saying? So the runtime is never really the issue. I think it comes down to more of the editing and the processing of the film itself that can either make it feel like a lean film or make it feel like there's a lot of fat left on the bone when you could have condensed it down to, 2 hours, for example. So in to kind of wrap up my thoughts, I would say the highlight for this film would be Miles Teller. Speaking of Chris Hemsworth, let's move on to number 24. So, as a lot of you probably picked up, the next film on our list, clocking in at number 24, is Thor: Love and Thunder. Out of all the films on this list, I'd say I was probably the most disappointed with Thor: Love and Thunder. I had such high expectations, like I'm sure a lot of you did. Taika coming back to direct this film, Thor Ragnarok breathed a whole new all new life into the character. I mean, at that point, not only was the audience kind of bored with the character, Chris Hemsworth was himself. He even said that he was kind of just going with the motions, and he didn't feel excited to play the character anymore. So when Taika came in, he came in with a whole new take, a whole new style, an added flair, and added personality to the character. Of course, he added some humor and some other things and made him more multi-dimensional rather than your just strong, axe-throwing, god of whatever the god of the Nine Realms, god of thunder, whatever. You know what I'm talking about. Asgard, that's the word I was thinking of. So, with Thor Ragnarok, one of my favorite entries in the entire MCU, I was excited for what they could do with this film. And we heard about the leaks. We heard about Christian Bale making his return to the genre and playing Gore the God Butcher. That was enough. I didn't need to hear any more. I was in. You get an Academy Award winning actor who has stepped into this genre of comic book movies. And of course, he had his success with the Dark Knight trilogy. He was amazing. He's still one of my favorite Batman to this day. So that was insane. And then, some other things started to come out. Then we heard the Guardians were going to be in this film. That's always exciting to have other characters appear in other, films. And then we heard Jane Foster was going to return, and they were going to do the sort of love and the sort of like Jane cancer storyline in the comics. So like the film sounded like it was going to be like really emotional, well, understanding that Taika's directing, so there's probably going to be some humor, some bright colors and things of that nature. But Taika is more than capable of telling an emotional, heavy story while balancing that comedic, fine line. I mean, if you watch Jojo Rabbit, that film is a satire on, Hitler and on, the Nazis and whatnot, but it also, reminds us how terrible they were. So if Taika is more than capable of doing that, so I had no worry that he wasn't going to be able to do that again with this film. And I just think that they blew the opportunity. I think they leaned way too far, and I hate having the same opinions as everybody else that you see on YouTube, but sometimes that is just simply my opinion, and I know you've probably heard this before from other people, but this film leaned way too far into the humor, and I just feel like they didn't do a good job balancing it. It's not that the problem isn't that there is humor, the problem is that there was too much humor. And the tone, therefore, was inconsistent, because when they would return to the elements of Jane and her cancer, or when they would return to Gore, those moments of the film that demanded that intensity, you couldn't buy into it as an audience member, because 5 seconds ago you had Russell Crowe dancing and twirling with his little skirt on as Zeus. So it was all over the place. And it felt more like a satire than it did it felt more like a satire of the character and of the genre than it did what we expected. Now, I know expectations and that's on you, but I mean, come on, you have Gore the God Butcher, and you don't even show him killing any gods aside from the opening scene of the film. In fact, I'd probably say the opening scene of that film, they set the tone. If they just could have continued down that pathway, we were in for a great ride. I remember when the film started and we see Gore and we see Christian Bale and he kills, it's the only kill we see on screen in the film, him killing a god. I was like, damn, we're in for a great ride. And then it totally just diverted from that. And then, of course, the rest is history. So, huge opportunity, missed opportunity. Like I said, you have an Academy level actor, and in the scene where they're explaining what he's doing, you just basically see a computer monitor screen montage of all the gods that had perished because of him. You could have even just shown him doing like a couple more And one could argue, oh, it's because of the rating. Whatnot. I don't believe that. You still could have done it, and it goes back to the Morbius argument. You can show violence in films while still being under the sort of PG-13 rating. Morbius is different. It's a vampire. We talked about that, but yeah. So, anyways, long-winded sort of rant on that. I would say the highlight. I had a hard time searching for a highlight in this film, just to be quite frank with you. I would say it's seeing the Guardians early in the film for the 3 minutes of screen time they had. That's really my highlight, and it sucks because when I first watched this film, I actually liked it, and then I rewatched it, and not even before I rewatched it, as I thought about the film, once I left the theater, I became to like it less and less. When I sort of processed it, I got the fanboyness out. It's a new Marvel movie, as I'm always excited. Once I got that out the way, and I had that clarity, and I started to really sit back and think about the film, I enjoyed it less. And then when I rewatched it, that further solidified my thoughts. So yeah, the highlight is seeing the Guardians early in the film. Let's move on to number 23. Coming in at number 23 is another Netflix film, The Gray Man. Now, I'm a big fan of the Russo brothers. I like what they've done in the MCU. I haven't really kept up with some of their work outside of it. I was interested in Cherry, and then I heard a lot of the negative reviews, and that kind of, deterred me away from watching it. Now, I like to try and ignore reviews as much as possible because I want to form my own opinion. But sometimes, and on the rare case that if it's an overwhelming amount of negative reviews for a movie, I'll just kind of put it in the back burner, and then I'll basically just watch it when I can or when the mood strikes, essentially. Because that's really does have a lot to do with watching a movie. It depends what mood you're in, right? If you're in the mood for, if you're on top of the world and you're feeling happy, you might want to watch, I don't know, whatever. You know what I mean? But yeah, so, however, with this film, I thought it looked very interesting. You have Ryan Gosling, you have, Chris Hemsworth, Chris Evans, excuse me. So you have Chris Evans, you have Ryan Gosling, basically tag teaming in this film, going against each other, in this like spy, espionage, hitman sort of plot. Essentially, Ryan Gosling's character is a hitman, but he's basically under the leash of the government, and the more people he kills, the more people that he's killing for the government, I think he gets like a reduced sentence or something like that. But he basically is under their leash as long as they want to continue contracting him to kill people. And Chris Evans' character, on the other hand, is the antagonist. Did that just turn off? Something like it just turned off. Oh, we're good. We're good. Sometimes the camera makes this sound, and it means that it turned off. But anyways, we're good. But yeah, and Chris Evans for me is probably the highlight. Ryan Gosling, great actor, and it wasn't really his fault, but he just played the sort of stoic, run and gun, Rambo-ish kind of character we've seen before, and they don't even really delve into his history very much. They do it in the beginning a little bit, but I feel like there was room for maybe more character development, maybe learn a little bit more about the character. Sometimes it's good to know less about a character that adds to the mystery, but I feel like it would have been nice to learn a little bit more about. I can't even remember his name. That's how forgettable the character was. Most of the character, like even Ana de Armas, you have another actress who is probably going to get nominated for Academy Award this year for Blonde, and once again, forgettable character. I didn't care about her. I didn't really care about any of them. I found Lloyd, who was Chris Evans' character. He's sort of the evil guy, the antagonist. He was the only one that was interesting. And I think the editing, the constant jumping from place to place. You're going to Berlin, you're going to here. It's this big sort of world globe-trotting event. And it just became exhausting as an audience member. It didn't feel earned that they were just constantly going around the globe like that. It was just a hodgepodge of just a bunch of different stuff. But the highlight of this film for me, I would say most of the action scenes were actually quite entertaining and were well choreographed for what they were. So for me, that's the highlight. Let's move on to number 22. All right, coming in at number 22 is a David Cronenberg body horror film titled Crimes of the Future. Now, similar to other films on this list, I was very excited for this. I'm a big fan of David Cronenberg, and he's kind of stepped away from the body horror, subgenre for a little while. He did some other movies. He did History of Violence. He did that movie with Michael Fassbender. He's done quite a few other movies that have strayed away from that body horror genre that he's made such a big mark on, and that's kind of what got him. That's what established him as a director. That's how people fell in love with his work, was that body horror genre. And it's not for everybody. It is very grotesque, and it's very in your face, which for some people that interests them. And I'm a fan of this subgenre, and I feel like we don't see enough of that made anymore. In today's climate of cinema, maybe it's just because there's a lot more sensitivity to that, and people don't, whatever the case, to each your own. Art is subjective. I just feel like this film, not enough happened, and when it concluded, it really, and before I continue, I'm not going to spoil any of these films, but by the way, so yes, some of these have come out almost a year ago at this point, but the point of these videos that I think a lot of content creators miss the mark on is that, yes, we're sharing our opinions on these films, and we're giving you our personal rankings, whether it's by enjoyment or whether you're looking at it from a critical perspective. I am sort of combining the two. I'm mostly ranking these based off my enjoyment, but then I'll observe them in the sort of critical perspective as well. But I think some of the things that these content creators miss the mark on is that you enjoy these films or you don't enjoy these films, and you're telling your viewers about them because you want to implore them on checking that out themselves, so then you can have a conversation, almost like you're having a conversation with your viewer, so that way they can return to the video and say, oh, I understand where he was coming from now. So that's sort of why I'm talking about some of these films here, not to get off track, but this felt more like a pilot, a very long pilot, a feature-length pilot, to an upcoming TV show than it did an actual film. It didn't feel conclusive. I wasn't satisfied at the end. Now, there are some redeeming qualities. I think the performances across the board from Viggo Mortensen, who's no stranger to David Cronenberg. They've worked with each other many, many times. I'm drawing a blank on some of the films he's done, but he's done quite a few films with Mr. Cronenberg. But Viggo was great. Leah Seydoux was great. Hopefully I pronounced her name correctly. And Kristen Stewart was great as well. So performances were fine. I just felt, for a movie that built itself up to be just this whole intense ride and just this craziness, it felt very tamed and very low key. Now, for the highlight, I would say the futuristic dystopian future. That for me was the highlight. The tension and the tone. They nailed the tone. The tone was great. And to sort of give you a little, synopsis of what Crimes of the Future is, it's set in a distant reality where technology has advanced enough to where now people are, it's going to sound crazy, I hope I explained this correctly, people are cutting themselves open and doing things with their organs on display almost as theater. It's considered art to them. And then they basically reconstruct themselves back together and they do it all over again. And people see that as art. And I think Kristen Stewart even describes this thing that people love, and I think she even says, I'm paraphrasing, but she says something along the lines of like, I would love to cut you open. It's almost as pleasurable as sex. So that's how they view it in that world. So very creepy, messed up, but right up my alley in terms of the kind of horror films that I like to watch. And I just feel like it was underwhelming personally. Not a terrible film, and we're slowly cracking into that, top 20. And a lot of these films going forward on the list, none of these I heavily dislike at this point. Let's just put it that way. Moving on to number 21. Number 21 is going to be Scott Derrickson's next feature, The Black Phone. I wish this film was a lot higher on this list because I'm a huge Scott Derrickson fan. I think he's an incredibly talented filmmaker, especially in the horror genre. That's where he made his mark. Of course, Sinister 2, every time I'm trying to remember somebody's work, I always draw blanks. But if you're familiar with Scott Derrickson, of course, he delved into the comic book genre a bit. He produced the most recent Doctor Strange film, and he directed the first one. So he's a very, very talented director. I just feel like the problem with this film is that there were some unanswered questions that I would have really liked to know the answer to by the end of this film. More very specifically, the daughter, the sister to the kid that was kidnapped. They sort of teased this. They left it a little bit ambiguous, which most of the time can work, but it was such an important factor to how she found her brother. And it essentially was this almost schizophrenic supernatural ability that she had. And it was never fully explained. They talked about it with the mom. They said the mom had it, and then I guess she couldn't control it, so she killed herself. So it's obviously referring to some kind of mental illness, but they're almost making it out to be some kind of superpower. And it seems like the daughter inherited it from the mom, and that's how she found her brother. They didn't fully flesh it out, and I would have appreciated them to actually give a little bit more detail on that, because that was that was the factor that solved the case. Essentially, the sister, the little girl, was able to basically almost telepathically see where her brother was with her mental ability, but that was kind of left unanswered. The father character, he's a terrible person. We see him in the first 2 acts of the film. He's abusive. He's clearly an alcoholic. He's hitting his kids. But then by the end of the film, he suddenly cares about them, and he's happy to see them again, and everything's all fine and dandy. And I just feel like that wasn't earned, considering we saw this man in the first 2 acts of the film, and he didn't seem like it seemed like he didn't give a single shit about his kids, and he was hurting them physically and emotionally. So that, for me, didn't really feel earned. However, the film was scary at times, and I think all of that had to do with Ethan Hawke's performance, and Ethan Hawke is the highlight of this film. Ethan Hawke, of course, has worked with Scott Derrickson before in the first Sinister film, and he was definitely the highlight. He did a really, really good performance. The kids, they did a great performance as well. I know I just talked about how the sister and her ability wasn't fully explained, but that's not really her fault. It's more of the storytelling. But I thought she did a fine job. I think the kid who got kidnapped, I think he did a good job too. And overall, I liked the film, but I didn't love it. And the highlight, once again, would be Ethan Hawke as the grabber. And he was just terrifying when he would go around in his van. And yeah, so moving on to the top 20. Coming in at number 20 is Black Adam. Now, Black Adam for me was exactly what I thought it was going to be. It was a fun, entertaining popcorn ride of a film. I didn't go in expecting the most, compelling, thought-provoking plot in the world. The trailers definitely lent the impression that this was going to be a very surface-level, generic story with some entertaining visuals and hopefully a cool, fun, memorable character that, in Black Adam. We'll get to that in a second. So it was entertaining. I loved the Justice Society. I loved Pierce Brosnan as Dr. Fate. It doesn't seem like he's going to come back, but I really hope he will. And Aldous Hodge, I've seen Aldous Hodge in some other films. He played MC Ren in the Straight Outta Compton biopic about the NWA. I think he was good in that. And he's been in some other stuff as well. But I really liked him as Hawkman. I can't remember the actor who played the guy who enlarges in size. I can't remember his name. He was good, and Cyclone was entertaining as well. So the Justice Society was really cool. Now, when it comes to Black Adam, and more specifically Dwayne Johnson, I think the performance was just okay. It was kind of just generic. Now, The Rock is not a terrible actor, but he's not a great actor either. Now, moving on to another criticism I have, it comes down to the writing, because Black Adam is an anti-hero. And whenever you have an anti-hero, that's usually a character that has multiple layers to them, complexities, things that can be relatable to certain people, right? And there's almost usually this internal fight that they're having with themselves. They're almost kind of arguing like what is right and what is wrong according to myself, okay? So there was an opportunity to create an interesting character, and I feel like the writing did not accomplish that. They definitely establish he's an anti-hero, but in reality, he's pretty much just a hero with just a little bit of an attitude at the end of the day. So, yeah. And the kid character, I could not stand him at all. I think he was annoying. I don't think the acting was very good as well, and it felt like the writers were trying way too hard to do their version of a John Connor T2 Judgment Day kind of pairing, and it just did not work at all. So yeah, for me, the highlight of this film was the action. It was very entertaining, and when The Rock was doing his thing and he was, throwing people around in the sky, like, it was entertaining. I liked it. But Pierce Brosnan, for me, is probably my highlight as Dr. Fate. He was so cool. So moving on to number 19. At number 19, I got Don't Worry, Darling, directed by Olivia Wilde. And for myself, I don't have this hatred for it that a lot of people do. And I think a lot of that has to do with some of the outside discussions that have been surrounding this film. I don't really care about that. For me, I just pay attention to the art itself, unless it's something absolutely terrible, obviously. But for the most part, it was just some drama going on behind the scenes. But it didn't really affect how I viewed the film. However, I have some issues with it. But there's a lot of redeeming qualities. I think the first hour of this film, great, amazing. And if it would have continued on the trajectory that it was going on, I think easily this film could have been in my top 10, for sure. But it was building the intrigue, it was building that curiosity, and I started to wonder, and now I'm not going to spoil the ending, but I started to wonder, what's happening? What is this remote community? Does this maybe have something to do with the Manhattan Project, which was all about the, atomic bomb testing in World War II? Are they going to, blur the lines of nonfiction and do kind of what Tarantino does and rewrite history in his own way? I thought maybe they were going to do something like that. And then when the ending happened, I didn't hate the ending to the film, but it felt too much. It felt too much like an episode of Black Mirror. And I talked about that with, I can't remember which film it was on this list, but the ending felt unearned. And it just felt like an easy way to say, this is what's really happening. It's not what you thought it was. So, I'm not going to spoil it, but there were some redeeming qualities. Number one, I think the production design and the costume design was great. I think this little community was something straight out of like Edward Scissorhands. It was really, really cool. I think the costumes, the clothes and everything like that, very, resemblance to the whole 1950s era. Chris Pine's performance for me was a standout. He played essentially the cult leader, this sort of Jim Jones-esque guy who's the head of this whole community and this project, as they're calling it throughout the film. Now, one other issue I have is I'm not a fan of films putting celebrities in their films that aren't really actors. And it's not even like producers are just getting these celebrities a cameo in this movie. Oftentimes they'll get these celebrities from other outlets of entertainment, like, singing or music or whatever. And they'll get them, it's not even like they're getting them for a cameo. They're getting them for like a main role. And I'm sure you're probably figuring out who I'm referring to, and that's Harry Styles. I don't think Harry Styles is a bad actor. I actually think he's not bad. And I think he has really, really good potential. And he's done some pretty notable performances. I mean, his short little performance in Dunkirk, I think that was his first time in a film. Like, for what it was good. But I think that he might have bit off more than he could have chewed with this character. I think there were many scenes, and they've been memeified now, but there's a lot of scenes in this film that require a lot of range emotionally, and I could see him reaching for it, but for me, it wasn't convincing enough. That's just me. That's just from an audience member perspective. Like I said, I don't want to sound pretentious because I'm not this amazing actor myself. I'm still learning. I still have a lot of room to grow. But if I'm looking at it from the pundit podcaster perspective, just giving my honest take, the scenes that required the range and the emotion and the climax, essentially, I just didn't get that. He wasn't terrible throughout the film. I think the scenes when he's just interacting with Florence Pugh, I could definitely sense their chemistry, if you know what I'm saying. So yeah, but not a terrible performance, but I'm just not a fan of these studios putting these celebrities in their films just for essentially the pure sake of a potential commercial return, just by people thinking, oh, this rapper I know or this songwriter singer I know is in this film. Well, I'm gonna go see it, right? Like it's gonna happen forever. It's not the first time it's happened. It's gonna continue to happen. It just kind of rubs me the wrong way, personally, for me. But not a bad film. I actually liked it overall. I just think the ending was a little bit lazy, but that's just my opinion. For me, the highlight is Florence Pugh's performance. I think she was by far the best in this film. So yeah, let's move on to number 18. So coming in at number 18 is Blonde, another Netflix film. And this is, if you're familiar with Marilyn Monroe and you've done some research, she had a very troubled life. She was sexually abused and taken advantage of many times by many predators throughout Hollywood, which unfortunately is still an issue that happens today. Not just in Hollywood, across many industries. There's always evil people in positions of power or authority that use that authority in terrible ways. And she unfortunately was a victim of that. And for me, the message and the awareness that they were trying to raise with this film, the message they were trying to get across, I got it. But my issue is they could have easily done it, and they could have easily conveyed that to the audience with half the amount of graphic, triggering scenes for a lot of people. It was rough. At times, I was like, did you really need to show that? Like we get it. We didn't need to see that much. And they could have accomplished the mission by, raising awareness for this ongoing issue in Hollywood. They could have easily done that with half the amount of scenes of her being taken advantage of and stuff like that. So yeah, that's just my gripe and my criticism with this film. However, the reason why it is higher on this list is for the sole purpose or the sole performance of Ana de Armas. Now, aside from her accent slipping a couple of times because she is Brazilian, and you do hear her accent from time to time slip in there, and apparently she took dialect training for over a year to get prepared, and I could definitely see that. I think for the most part, I didn't hear it, but at times I did notice it. But aside from that, her performance was absolutely incredible, and she absolutely deserves, I keep using the word absolutely, she deserves to be nominated for Best Actress this year. A few notable scenes for me. There's a scene where she goes in for a reading for a film, basically an audition. And she's just amazing, and obviously the tears start coming forward, and you can tell while she's auditioning, and she's doing it in front of like 9 people, studio executives, producers, the director, probably writers and all that. She's doing it in front of all these people, which inevitably is a daunting task. She's got all the eyes on her, and she just kills it. And for me, I like movies that are about Hollywood. Now, obviously, this is different. This is movies about terrible people in Hollywood, but I like movies about movies getting made and that whole process. It just fascinates me. So the scenes like that, when we see her acting in a film and stuff like that, that was intriguing because she does such a great performance. But just obviously the other scenes, the very heavy scenes that acquired a lot of emotion and range, she just knocked it out of the park. So she was amazing. A couple side performances as well that I noticed. I can't remember his name. Great actor from The Pianist, Adrian Brody. I can't remember the person that he's playing, but he plays one of Marilyn Monroe's husbands, and yeah, just Marilyn Monroe's life. My God, she went through hell, and it's really tragic. She went through multiple different partners. As I mentioned earlier, she was abused multiple times, taken advantage of multiple times, and it just never seemed like she could catch a break. And from what I saw in the film, as to how they portray the character, it just seemed like she was searching for just love and just somebody to be there. And she couldn't ever get that in return. It was either I'll give you love, but you have to do this for me, which isn't actually love. That's not you loving somebody. That's a give and take. That's not love. Not to sound corny, but she just wanted somebody in her life that truly cared about her, and she just couldn't ever find that. Yeah, and the other performance that stood out for me as well, I don't know the actor's name, but he starred in The Watcher. He was the dad. I've seen him in some other films. He's played supporting roles in like The Irishman. He was one of like the cops in Paul Blart's Mall Cop. So he did pretty well as well. But like I said, the reason why this film is this high on this list is not because of all the terrible graphic scenes and all that. It is the sole reason why it's this high is simply because of Ana de Armas, and actually a couple of other things, some technical stuff. Like, for example, for me, the cinematography, excuse me, turn that off there. The cinematography was the highlight, aside from the obvious Ana de Armas performance. But I'm a sucker for black and white, and they intercut between black and white and color, and you could tell it's shot on film, so you have that grain. So yeah, that for me, that was probably the highlight. But definitely a tough watch. I wouldn't suggest you gather the whole family together to watch this film because it's pretty heavy. But moving on to number 17. Coming in at number 17 is Barbarian. Now, out of all the films on this list, this was probably the biggest surprise. This came out of nowhere for me. I saw a trailer, thought it looked okay. I was bored. It was like a Tuesday night. I was like, fuck it. I'll go watch it. And this totally caught me by surprise. It was incredible. And that second act, midpoint of the film, and I'm sure you'll know, people watching, if you've seen the film, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. When that shift happens and that beat happens, and then right after that, we're introduced to Justin Long. When we see that creature and we see what happens between our main character and Bill Skarsgård, that was like totally wild. And then that leads us to the second half of the film. This was amazing, and I heard the director, Zach Kreger, who is the highlight for me in this film. I think his direction was amazing. His storytelling was amazing, and apparently this was his directorial debut. So wow, just hats off to you. That is incredible. Yeah, and this was actually pretty scary. There was a lot of scenes that caused a lot of anxiety for me. And I think the thing that stood out to me the most, though, was the writing, because I don't know if Zach Kreger wrote this, but whoever wrote this film, they knew what the audience was going to be thinking multiple times, and the film could have easily been predictable. But for example, when our main character, she is staying in an Airbnb and she's sharing it for the evening with essentially a stranger and Bill Skarsgård, and that in and of itself can go very, very wrong. And usually films that have that kind of idea and that plot will make that opposing character very creepy, very perverted. But instead, he wrote Bill Skarsgård's character to be conscientious of that. And he even offers like, hey, like, I'll make you a drink. Like, I can make the drink in front of you so you don't think I'm trying to roofie you. Like, I appreciated that. He could understand, he could tell what the audience was going to jump to and think. So very clever writing. But for me, the highlight was Zach Kreger's direction. And I love the ending. And it's hard to talk about this film without spoilers, so I'm going to keep it very vague. But really, really enjoyed this film, and it clocks in at number 17. So let's move on to number 16. Number 16, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. Out of all the Marvel films that came out this year, this is probably my second favorite. Kind of spoiler alert, that means Wakanda Forever is my favorite Marvel movie, and it is on this list. We'll talk about it later. But nonetheless, I appreciated this film. I'm not the biggest Sam Raimi film, but what I liked about this was that this version of New York City that we actually see, you can definitely tell that Sam Raimi had a style. He had a style, and he had his creative juices flowing into this, because this very much felt like the New York City that we've seen in those Sam Raimi Spider-Man films. However, at the same time, Sam Raimi's kind of, quips and little campy humor didn't always work for me, but sometimes I enjoyed it. And I think this definitely progressed Doctor Strange's arc as a character. We're starting to see different layers of him. He's becoming less arrogant, and this film really dealt with the message of arrogancy, if that's even a word. Arrogancy, whatever. It's dealing with Doctor Strange being reckless and while he is a genius, he may not always make the right decision, and maybe sometimes his decision making could be more impulsive than actually critically thought out, because a lot of characters ask him, referencing the blip, like, are you sure? Are you absolutely sure that was the only way things could have played out? And you could see Stephen Strange kind of step back for a moment and think about and ponder on that. Now, of course, he replies and says, that was the only way, but you can see that he might not have fully considered all the different outcomes. I know in Infinity War, he said he looked at all 14 million, possible outcomes, but interesting. And they piggyback off that when we find out how the 838 Doctor Strange was killed, and it's because he had the knife in his hand, as Christine always said in the film, like, you always need to be the one that has the knife in the hand. And he made a decision. He didn't talk about it with his fellow Illuminati members, and it ended up causing an incursion, and that then established what incursions are. So it did some things for the multiverse. It established some things. It introduced us to incursions. But at the same time, for a movie that's called Multiverse of Madness, they only really visited 3 universes. They had that scene where, he quickly jumped through all these different universes, but we only spent a significant amount of time in about 3. We, obviously, our current 616, 838, and then the one where we see the evil Doctor Strange in that sort of dystopian reality. And for me, I would have liked to see them go a little bit more into the multiverse, considering the film is called Multiverse of Madness. As for the Illuminati, I thought it was a bold choice to introduce them and kill them off. It was a bold choice, and it worked for me. I liked it. It was cool. We got the John Krasinski cameo that everybody, was chomping at the bit for. I don't think he's going to return as Reed Richards. That's just me. And I like how this is a continuation of Wanda's storyline. A lot of people have complained that her villain turn felt unearned, but I think it actually made a lot of sense. If you watch WandaVision, they pretty much pick up right where she left off. So for me, her antagonist turn really made sense, and I didn't mind it at all. So yeah, overall, thumbs up for this film. And for me, the highlight is Benedict Cumberbatch. I love him as an actor, and I'm really starting to get more interested in Doctor Strange, especially now that we have some of the main staple Infinity Saga characters in the rear view, which I'm sure they'll return in Secret Wars. We're starting to see that he is playing a more predominant role and will probably take on more of a leadership role in these future Avenger films. And I'm just finding the character more enjoyable on each viewing. So that's number 16. Let's move on to number 15. Number 16, I got Avatar: The Way of Water. Now, I'm sure to a lot of you that might be controversial. This film has been, in my opinion, a little bit overrated, if I'm being completely honest with you. Obviously, it is a spectacle. It is breaking ground from a visual filmmaking perspective. These films continue to just it's almost like magic. I will never argue that these Avatar films are in untouched territory, or they're essentially paving a new way for filmmaking, for visual storytelling. It's absolutely incredible. So visually, this film is amazing. From a story perspective, I do think the story was a little bit better in this. I appreciated them focusing on the family aspects, but overall, I feel pretty much the same about this film as I did with the first Avatar. I liked it. I liked watching it in the theater, but I'll probably never rewatch it again until the next one comes out. That might sound harsh. There were some aspects of this that I liked more than the first film. As I mentioned, the family dynamics, seeing Jake Sully and Neytiri, and they had their kids. I thought those performances were good. I just think it is kind of an exhausting film. There's a lot that goes on. It is very, very long, and I didn't feel like that runtime lent for especially with how everything played out, I don't think it lent to a lot of rewatchability. But I liked it though. That's why it's number 15. I did really enjoy it. It's a great theater experience. In fact, most traditional 3D movies will give you just your standard traditional glasses. But because James Cameron is constantly reinventing the wheel and creating something that hasn't been done before, they had to give the audience that I was seeing the film with, they had to give us like these weird goggles. I mean, couldn't even keep them at the end of the film because they were so advanced. They weren't just your traditional plastic. So that was pretty cool. For me, the highlight would probably be the visuals. I mean, so yeah. So that's number 15. Let's move on to number 14. Number 14, Bones and All, directed by Luca Guadagnino, starring Timothée Chalamet and Taylor Russell. This is a film about, I'm not going to spoil anything, but the trailers do tell you that it is about cannibalism. But in this film, in this storyline, it seems to be more common. They don't fully explain why there are people like this. Now, unlike a movie like The Black Phone, where I would have liked to know a little bit more about the little girl's, ability, I believe for this film, I think they made the right choice not fully fleshing out who, they're called eaters in the film, who the eaters are, why they are, who they are, is it a disease? Like, I like how they kind of leave that a little bit ambiguous, and they give you clues and stuff like that, but they establish that there are actually quite a few eaters in the world than most people probably expect. And I knew this was going to be a dark film going into it, but oh my God, the scenes where you actually see people being eaten alive it far exceeded how gross I thought. Like, it went to another level. So it was pretty rough at times, and it definitely would turn you off your appetite if you're eating a steak or something. I'll just leave it there. But for me, some of the standouts, Mark Rylance, his character was absolutely creepy and terrifying. And Timothée Chalamet and Taylor Russell were great. Timothée Chalamet is one of the best young actors coming up. He's about to blow up. I think he already is blowing up. He's insane. I'm excited to see him return as Paul Atreides in Dune Part 2. But overall, an enjoyable film. Some pretty nasty scenes. But I think what it did was it took these very complex, difficult to understand characters, and they added elements of humanity in them. So you could at least not sympathize for them, because they're literally eating people. That's they're murdering people, but they're adding a twist on it, and it's not just they're adding complexity. And I think when you add complexity and when you add character flaws, that's what makes a character memorable. But it is pretty fucking nasty. So don't go in with a full stomach. You will probably be sick. The cinematography was beautiful. The ending was insane. Please watch this film. Report back to me. I want to hear what you think about the ending, because the ending was crazy. And for me, the highlight is Luca Guadagnino. I think this guy is an underrated filmmaker. I would like to see him make more movies. Of course, he wrote Call Me By Your Name, the Suspiria remake on Amazon, and he's a very talented filmmaker, and I'm excited to see what he does next. Let's move on to number 13. So coming in at number 13 is Top Gun Maverick. Now, I will admit I have not seen the original Top Gun. Still haven't seen it to this day. I'll get around at some point to watching it. But this was directed by Joseph Kosinski, and apparently this film has been in the making for decades. Obviously, this film took 33 something odd years to even happen. And this was a pure popcorn fest. Similar to Avatar, the visuals were incredible. But the thing I appreciated about the most that obviously separated it from, what we see in Avatar. Obviously, Avatar is fictitious, and this is fictitious as well, but there is still that sense of practicality. We know that a lot of the action scenes are being shot in real fighter jets going up in the air, and so we can see that. You can tell when that's real, despite how amazing the visual effects might be in Avatar and Pandora. There's that sense of of realism in this. And don't get me wrong, I love my big fantasy blockbusters. I'm a fucking MCU nerd, so that should be no secret. But at the same time, I like watching a spectacle action film where I know what I'm watching happened. So, and obviously Tom Cruise is known and notorious for, enthralling himself in the character, and well, not so much the character, but more of the action and, like I said, the practicality in the stunts and so forth. So, and interesting characters. I haven't seen Top Gun. I understand the connection, and I understand how Miles Teller, who's playing Rooster, is the son of Tom Cruise's wingman and best friend from the first film. So there's that connection, and I know that his father died in the first film. So now that there's this sort of tension between them, because while it technically wasn't Tom Cruise's fault, Miles Teller believes that the lion's share of the blame to his father's death was caused by Maverick. So there's that tension, but we also see that throughout the film they kind of set aside their differences, and then inevitably they come together. I also liked Glenn Powell. I don't know what that was. I think he was really, really good as well. He's sort of like the cocky asshole douchebag guy, but then he comes in at the end and sort of gives him that extra punch. And that whole scene. So basically throughout the film, without spoiling anything, they are planning to get into enemy territory, but they need to do it in a way that they're not going to be noticed. Because if they're noticed, then the enemy territory, they have these automatic gunners on these hillsides that are like just programmed to just shoot and just lock onto the target. So they need to do it in a clever way, so they're under the radar, but they still need to make their way through enemy territory. And they basically train for months in the film, and they try and emulate what it's actually going to be like with the G-force and everything. And that was really, really cool. And that third act was just a pure spectacle. I wasn't as high on this film as some other people were. But I could definitely see this thing getting some Academy Award nominations. For me, the highlight was the sound. The sound was amazing. You can literally feel it in your legs and in your body when those fighter jets, those whatever, I don't even remember the names of the planes, but when they're going off and you're in those action scenes and those dogfight scenes, you can. It's so loud, it's like sending vibrations through your body. So yeah, for me, the sound was definitely the highlight. So moving on to number 12. Number 12, we have Men, which was written and directed by Alex Garland, who is a very, very talented filmmaker and writer. He directed Ex Machina, and he's written many other films. I'm pretty sure he wrote, I can't even remember, I'm drawing a blank, but he's a great filmmaker. And I would say this is the best horror film of the year, hands down. And I haven't seen enough people really talk about this film. It's incredible. It's basically about a woman, without spoiling anything. She's lost somebody in her life in a very tragic way. And she basically retreats to this mansion, and she's just trying to process this guilt, and she's mourning, and she's essentially given herself a little vacation. And she goes to this remote town, and she stays in this mansion. She's just there. She probably like Airbnb or something. She's there for like a week just to help process through her grieving and just sort of be alone. Because for some people, they like to be alone during that process. For others, they like to have family and friends around to support them. But while she's staying in this remote mansion, she's the only one in the house, and she starts to notice that she's seeing all these different people, but they all look the same. It's all the same guy. And it starts to get creepier and creepier and creepier. And eventually these people, these avatars, if you will, they all start to get closer and closer to her. And then I won't spoil it. You don't know for sure if she actually is seeing the same person cloned, or maybe they're real. Who knows? But if I say any more, I'll probably spoil it. But yeah, it is absolutely insane. There is one scene, not a spoiler, but it's early in the film. There is a stranger outside her home. Like when she's in this mansion, throughout the day, she also brings her laptop, so she tries to get some work done. And she's completely oblivious that there's just this naked stranger circling the perimeter of her home, trying to find a way in. And finally she notices, and I won't say what happens next, but that whole scene was just anxiety inducing. You're watching her completely unaware, and you see in the sort of foreground that there's this naked dude just like peering into the windows, and it's just like, turn around. So yeah, and Jessie Buckley plays the main character as Harper. I haven't seen her in a lot of films, but I'm starting to become a real fan. I think she's a great actress. And the guy who plays all these different characters, because as I mentioned, she's seeing all these different people that live in this town, but it's all like the same guy, and that's played by the actor Roy Kinnear. He was in the first episode I ever watched of Black Mirror. And for those of you who've seen that episode, you'll know what I'm talking about. He plays the president or the prime minister, one or the other, of the United States, and the princess gets captured by terrorists, and the terrorists request they basically negotiate that we'll give her back to you if you have sex with a pig. That was my first ever episode. I think that actually is the first Black Mirror episode. That's, to this day, that and USS Callister, those are probably the two most fucked up ones out there. But yeah, number 12 is Men. Let's move on to number 11. Number 11, we got Bullet Train, directed by David Leitch, who has played many different roles in the film and television industry. He was formerly a stunt double, and actually stunt doubled for Brad Pitt in a couple of movies, notably he doubled for him in Fight Club. So he's very familiar with Brad Pitt. He has a pre-established relationship with him. So they team up, but this time he's directing Brad Pitt. So I like how that kind of comes full circle. And David Leitch is obviously very familiar with the action genre. He directed the first John Wick, which I believe is still the best one out of the franchise. And you can tell that there is a mastermind behind a lot of the stunts and behind a lot of the things you see in these kind of movies. Because usually in these big action movies, you have what's called a second unit. You have a second unit director. You have obviously stuntman and completely different people filling in. But what a second unit director usually is there for is to direct all the action scenes that can't be done traditionally with the normal director. He's still involved, but it's usually just the director directing all the stuntmen pretty much. But I don't know this to be true or not, but there probably wasn't a second unit director. David Leitch probably just directed everything because he's so familiar with that territory. And this film was just a lot of fun. The character's hilarious. Brad Pitt, he's this assassin that's sort of rehabilitated, and he often references his time in therapy and the sort of strategies that he's used, like in front of us, like when he's in confrontation with his enemies in the film. He'll pause and he'll try and say something like, in moments like this, we're not seeing eye to eye, but there's a door, and in front of that door is an opportunity. And then it's hilarious. But the colors popped. This takes place, I think, in like Japan or Singapore. I could be wrong. And it implements a lot of the sort of manga anime pop culture in there, so that was cool to see. There's a lot of cameos from a lot of celebrities, so I won't spoil that. But for me, the highlight was Tangerine and the Lemon characters played by Aaron Taylor Johnson and Brian Tyree Henry. I would watch a spin-off film of just those characters. But more specifically, if I had to pick one highlight, it would be Aaron Taylor Johnson's character. I think he was awesome. So yeah, Bullet Train for me coming in at number 11. Let's move on to number 10. Number 10, The Whale. Now, I've seen this film twice. I saw it on Christmas Day. Told my mom about it. My mom just was intrigued, and that was a movie kind of right up her alley. She doesn't really see movies that much in the theater. She only goes if it's something. She's not really a big fan of the comic book genre. She's very much only interested in the grounded, takes on real people. So this was right up her alley. So then I saw it with her. I enjoyed it more the second time. Now, let's just get this completely out the way. Brendan Fraser will and should win the Oscar for Best Actor, and it's not even close. The gap between him and even somebody like Austin Butler, and Austin Butler was fantastic as Elvis. I don't want to, shame on him or anything like that. He was amazing, but what Brendan Fraser did, it's funny because I didn't even know Brendan Fraser had that in him. I, of course, had seen a lot of his films when I was younger, like Journey to the Center of the Earth and the Mummy films, but I didn't know that he had that kind of range in him. Like, it just never dawned to me. And he was amazing. Hong Chow, who plays his support worker, she was also incredible. She had a few scenes. Most notably, there's a scene when she's talking to this missionary, and I won't explain what was happening in the context of that scene, but she just became really, really emotional, and I think that she deserves at least a Best Supporting Actress nomination. The only negative for me, Ty Simpkins, who played the missionary that I just mentioned, he looked familiar to me, and then I looked up his IMDb. He actually was a child actor, and he was in Iron Man 3, he was in Insidious, and I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't really impressed with his performance. I felt, there's times when if I can tell, it's not that he didn't know his lines, but it didn't seem natural, and I could tell he was like preemptively thinking about what he was gonna say before saying his lines. And like, I'm not trying to sound pretentious here. Like he didn't do a bad job, but it wasn't believable compared to like Hong Chow, Brendan Fraser. I mean, it makes sense. You're sharing the screen with some amazing performers. You gotta try and bring your best. So he wasn't terrible, but I don't think he was as convincing as some of the other characters. Like even Sadie Sink, for example, she was great. She plays Brendan Fraser's younger daughter. And basically, what the sort of plot of this film is, it's about a character named Charlie, and he's dealing with he's dealing with tragedy because he lost someone very close to him, and he has been essentially self-medicating by eating, and now it's become a compulsion. It's become an addiction, essentially, and he's essentially lost all control in it. And of course, that is a contributing factor to as he's so big, and it's just a very powerful, sad, emotional performance. And this is, when I say this is an emotional film, like I was in tears, and I definitely wouldn't be watching this film, like I said, with the sort of intention on feeling uplifted or high spirited after, because you won't. But at the same time, it's powerful, because the thing I pulled from it the most was simply to be kind. Because you never know what somebody could be going through. And I know we hear that all the time, but Darren Aronofsky talked about this film, and he talked about how in real life, if you were to see somebody like Charlie on the street, somebody who, is obese, or not even just obese, or somebody that is, has some kind of, physical deformity or some kind of mental challenge, you're not even going to look at them. A lot of people just treat them as invisible. And I think with this film, it made me more empathetic, and it made me more conscious of, not that I wasn't a kind person before, I am, but now I'm really kind of, my perspective has changed a bit, and it made me feel good, and it made me feel good to, I don't know how to articulate this very well. It just made me more conscious of other people and how we truly never know what somebody's going through, and it's just important to be kind. So yeah, not to ramble on, but the highlight for me, Brendan Fraser, obviously he was incredible. So that's my number 10. Let's move on to number 9. My number 9 is Elvis, directed by Baz Luhrmann, starring Austin Butler, who we just talked about. Now, while I said the gap between Brendan Fraser and Austin Butler is very, very wide, I still believe that Austin Butler should get nominated for Best Actor. He's not going to win. It's going to go to Brendan Fraser, but he certainly deserves to be nominated in that conversation, because he's talked about many occasions, and a lot of people have made jokes about how his voice is forced, but when you train your dialect to try and come as close as it can to matching a real person, it's going to have an effect on you afterwards. You're not just going to be able to switch. When you work at this all day, which he has spoken about many times, and he said that he worked with dialect coaches, he would watch old interviews, and he worked at it day and night. So, I don't know, I just don't understand why people are trying to poke fun at him. I think it actually just shows how much of himself he gave to pull this performance off. And I believed him as Elvis. I think it was perfect. He apparently did a lot of the actual singing and performing in the film, which usually you can tell if somebody's lip syncing. Some, like, obviously he didn't sing everything, but a lot of the performances, like, I think he did have Hound Dog. I think he also did. I can't even remember, but yeah, he was great. Unlike most people, I actually enjoyed the frantic, chaotic pace and editing of this film because I think it actually lends to how frantic and chaotic Elvis's life was. I think if this was just this sort of like smooth kind of, pace film, yet you have all this chaos going on in Elvis's life, I think it sort of would have felt out of balance. So I think it actually added to the story. And then for me, the highlight was a production design. This film spans across like the 50s, the 60s, and obviously the early 70s when he passed away. And from the shots in Vegas, from the early shots when Elvis met Colonel Tom Parker in the festivals and the theme parks, like it was amazing. And speaking of Tom Hanks, I think he was very good as well. A lot of people have criticized his performance. I think he did great as well. He could even get a Best Supporting Actor nomination. I don't think he'll win, but I definitely think it was good enough to receive that. So yeah, so for me, production design was the highlight. Moving on to number 8. Coming in at number 8, we got Jordan Peele's third feature film, Nope. This was one of my most anticipated films of the entire year. When we first got that poster showing down in the horizon or down in the foreground, there's just like a little town. It almost looked like there was a carnival or something going on. And then up in the sky, you see a cloud, but there's like a ribbon hanging from it. And at the time, everybody I spoke to, we couldn't seem to guess what that was. And it makes complete sense when you watch the film. There's a lot of comparisons to Jaws, and it makes sense. Now, I don't consider this a spoiler, but throughout the film, Keke Palmer and David Kaluuya, they're brother and sister, and they're trying to spot where the UFO is and where it's essentially hibernating throughout the day and where it's hiding from everybody. And they figure out that it hides up in the clouds, which is inevitably you could see the parallels between that and Jaws, because in that film, the monster, the shark, it hides and lurks in the water. In this film, the monster, the alien, sort of hides and traverses through the clouds. That's sort of its ocean, so to speak. So I understood the comparisons to Jaws, and I really, really like this film. I would say it's better than Us. I'd still give the slight edge to Get Out, but all three of his films I thoroughly enjoy. In this film, the DP was Hoyt van Hoytema, who has done a couple films with Christopher Nolan. Most recently, he did Tenet with him, and I think he's even doing Oppenheimer with him right now, which will be coming out next year. So the cinematography was amazing. It was filmed in IMAX, and it was beautiful to watch. Now, this I gotta be careful because I don't want to spoil. There's been a lot of alien movies that have come out over the years, and there's always an explanation to what the aliens are, where they came from, and without spoiling anything, I'll just say the way this film explained what was happening, what the alien is, where it's from, so on and so forth, what it does, watch out for that. It's unique. And to my knowledge, it's never been done like that before. So he created a nice separation from the alien subgenre. Yeah. And I think the performances across the board were great. So coming in at number 8 is Nope. Coming in at number 7, Black Panther Wakanda Forever. Now, I know some of you will consider this a hot take, but I don't care. I actually think this film is better than the first. Yes, I said it. Obviously, I love T'Challa. I love Chadwick Boseman. Forget the whole Black Panther character. He was an incredible actor, and he will sorely be missed. He was an activist. He was a philanthropist. He was just overall a good person. However, when it pertains to this film, they handle his death and his character's death with class, with beauty, with poise. They didn't do it in an exploitative way. They didn't say, Kang killed him, so therefore Kang is a threat we got to worry about. They didn't use it to, propel the overall narrative of the MCU. They did it in a way where it was handled with care. And I didn't doubt it wasn't going to be, because I know Ryan Coogler is an esteemed filmmaker. Letitia Wright gave a great performance. She got a major character upgrade. Obviously, considering that all the weight of the film, the world, the story was going to fall on her shoulders, and she definitely exceeded expectations. So she was fantastic. I have no problem with her being Black Panther either. I thought her suit looked cool. And I was skeptical going into the film. I was like, how are they going to do it? There's no heart-shaped herb. She doesn't really have any combat skills. There probably would have been a couple of other candidates, maybe Lupita Nyong'o's character or Okoye, but they handled it, like I said, with care, and they proved me wrong, and I was happy to be proven wrong. So for me, the highlight is Tenoch Huerta as Namor. He's probably my favorite villain we've gotten in the MCU since Thanos. He was absolutely incredible. I'm not including the No Way Home villains because they were coming from previous franchises. I'm just talking about new MCU villains that we are being introduced to. So hopefully we will see Namor again. I'm sure we will. Black Panther Wakanda Forever comes in at number 7. Let's move on to number 6. Number 6, we got The Fabelmans. Now, I saw this film at TIFF. That was my first experience ever going to a film festival, and I had such a fun time. You're surrounded by so many other passionate moviegoers, and at the same time, you're also surrounded by the pretentious cinephile ones out there that think their opinion is the holy grail and it's the only opinion that matters. So it was a nice blend. You know, you had passionate film fans that were, you know, eager and love to converse with other film fans, and then you had the other ones. But you know, anyways, but I loved it. I think it was great. I don't think it's as good as his last film, West Side Story, but this is still, I mean, it's my number 6 film, so I really, really enjoyed it. And I found a lot of things very relatable to me. Now, I myself don't want to necessarily be a director. However, at some point in my career, I would be against directing. I want to be an actor. But the struggle of trying to pursue something so difficult and trying to convince your family that this is the right choice, that is not even just with this medium, but in any form of art, that is going to be a challenge. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. So there's various moments throughout the film where our main character, who is essentially Steven Spielberg, this whole film is pretty much an autobiography of Steven Spielberg's life without doing an exact like the character we're seeing is not Steven Spielberg. It's something Fabelman. I can't remember his name, but there's moments throughout the film where he's talking to his father, and his father is referring to his filmmaking career aspirations as a hobby. That is one of the most condescending things you could say to somebody, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. I myself have been told that before, or at least talked to in that manner. Like, how's the little acting thing coming? It's like, fuck you. How's your little job going? Like, it's just one of the most... And half the time, like, you can't fully blame them because I don't think they get that they're being that rude and condescending. But sometimes you got to put them in their place and say, hey, man, you're pursuing your thing, and you don't see me talking down to you. You know, I'm doing my thing. You know, just respect that I am. You don't have to agree with it. Just, I know what's best for me. You know what's best for you. So don't be a fucking asshole about it. But anyways, so that I can relate to. A lot of people just kind of, you know, whenever I tell somebody I want to be an actor, I'm very perceptive. I can see what they're thinking, and this fucking guy wants to be an actor. It's like, I haven't heard that one before. And I could see the eye rolls. I could just see a whole change in behavior. They're like, oh, okay, nice, yeah. So that's why half the time when somebody asks what I want to do for a living, I don't even say actor. Not that I don't take ownership of it, but I just know what they're thinking, so I don't even bother. I just say, oh, you know, I'm, you know, pursuing something creative and blah, blah, blah. Even then, they're like, whatever, this fucking guy right here. Yeah, so this film was very relatable to me in that regard. And just the family dynamic between, you know, Steven Spielberg. I'm just going to call him Spielberg, you know, the main character, between Spielberg and his mom and everything like that. There's elements that I'm sure almost anybody watching can probably pull from. So, yeah, for me, it comes in at number 6. I loved it. Now let's crack in to the top 5. Everything Everywhere All at Once comes in at number 5. Now, this film used to be a little bit higher. I think it was at my number 2 or my number 3. It would always shuffle with this one other film that I will talk about shortly. But then, some other films came out that I'll talk about shortly. But rest assured, this is still, like, pretty much 5 through 1 here. I love all these films. I was pulling straws at this point. So these are all amazing films. But number 5 is Everything Ever All at Once. I was familiar with Michelle Yeoh. I'd seen her in some other films. I saw her in Shang-Chi, and she just completely won me over. She was incredible. Jamie Lee Curtis as this sort of tax auditor, she was hilarious as well. And I don't want to say too much about this, because if you haven't seen it, and a lot of you probably have because it's garnered so much attention, go into this film without knowing as little, with knowing as little as possible. For me, the highlight was the husband character played by the actor from The Goonies. Apparently he hasn't acted in like 20-something years. He went over to stunt work, and now he's kind of making his acting debut. I believe he deserves a Best Supporting Actor nomination. I think he was that good in this. And even Michelle Yeoh, best actress. So this was amazing, and this was definitely the best multiverse movie we've seen in the last couple of years. So that's my number 5. Moving on to number 4. My number 4 is going to be Glass Onion. Now, this film easily rewards you for rewatch. Like, it's the most rewatchable film out of the whole bunch. And it rewards you for rewatching it because, given that it's a murder mystery and there's clues and there's subtleties that you're likely going to miss on your first viewing, when you rewatch it after knowing how the story plays out, you start to pick apart and you start to notice new things that you didn't before. And then each time you're pulling back the layers of the glass onion, pun intended. And this was incredible. And for me, I think it was an ensemble done right. Each character had their moments, as they did in the first film. And I like how we're getting new installments of these films, and you could watch them in any order. I watched this film, I watched it in theaters, but then I rewatched it with my sister and her fiance, and they hadn't seen Knives Out. So this is their first introduction to the Knives Out franchise, and they loved this film, and then from there they watched Knives Out. So I love how each one of these films, the only connective tissue or the only dot that's sort of connecting all this together is Benoit Blanc, but we're going to get a new cast of characters, a new mystery every single time. And I also have to tip my hat off to Rian Johnson. I would say this film definitely deserves an Academy Award for, or a nomination at least for Best Director and Best Original Screenplay. I believe this is an original screenplay. Either that or an adapted screenplay. One or the other. Now, I mentioned this with Zach Kreger earlier, how he knew what the audience was going to be thinking. Rian Johnson took that a step further. The way he was able to write this film was just absolutely genius. I'm just sitting here. It almost discourages me from ever wanting to write again. It's like, how could I ever compete with that? It is fucking insane. Like, I wrote my short film that's going to be coming out soon, and I'm currently writing my next one that me and some people will be shooting in February. But I almost feel like with a guy like this out there, why do I even try? You know what I mean? But jokes aside, like he knows what the audience is thinking. Like, for example, there's a scene in the film, without spoiling anything, where Janelle Monáe, actually I can't. Okay, I'll put it this way: two characters are working out the motives and opportunities for who could have killed who. That's all I'll say. And they literally create a chart. Like, one category says M, motives, one category says opportunities. And when they get to certain characters that the audience would probably easily go to as, oh, he definitely did it, he had to have done it, shortly after you'll hear Benoit Blanc say, nah, he couldn't have done it. It would be too obvious. It wouldn't make sense. And then as an audience member, you're like, oh, fuck, well, there goes that theory. So it was genius the way he wrote this movie. And I don't even know how you come up with this stuff, to be quite frank. So, yeah. And Benoit Blanc is honestly becoming one of my all-time favorite characters, period. Like, I love the dialect. I love the poise. I love the fashion as well. That's another big thing. There was a lot of, like, nice outfits in this film, specifically worn by Benoit Blanc. So, while I think this isn't, I'd give the slight edge to Knives Out, I still love this movie, and definitely the best Netflix film that has come out this year by far. So that's my number 4. Moving on to my number 3. Number 3 is coming in with Babylon. Now, I just watched Babylon for the first time a few days ago, and I was completely enthralled in this. It was an experience. And Damien Chazelle, is a fantastic director. Of course, he directed Whiplash, which is one of my favorite films of all time. La La Land, which I was pretty late to watching that film, but I love it. I think it's great. I still probably think Whiplash is my favorite of his. But any movie that is about Hollywood, in the history of Hollywood, and the making of movies, as I talked about earlier, that is always going to be intriguing to me. And this movie specifically is about an era of Hollywood that hasn't really been adapted into a sort of film television format. And that's the 1920s to the 30s, from the transitional period between, between when films transitioned from silent pictures to, as they called them, talkies at the time, when sound started to get implemented into pictures. And this is an absolute roller coaster. I love this movie from beginning to end. And the ending of this film, without telling you exactly what happens, there's almost like a post-credit scene, and it's just like a montage of how far cinema has come since way back then. And it was beautiful to watch as someone who is a very passionate film fan myself, and I'm sure a lot of you will appreciate that as well. And this film centers around three characters. I can't remember the one actress. I had never seen him before. Let me find this out. It centers around Margot Robbie, Brad Pitt, and this other person. Babylon film. Diego Calva, yeah, and I'm not too familiar with his work, but he was incredible. There's also some minor roles from Olivia Wilde and Tobey Maguire, and it was just absolutely amazing. And there's a scene when Margot Robbie is making a movie. There's several scenes, but there's one in particular when she was first kind of coming up in the industry, because we see her trajectory, and we see Diego Calva's character. We see their trajectory into fame and fortune. Whereas Brad Pitt, when we first see him in the film, he's already the successful main staple actor at that time that everybody knows and loves, and we actually see him on the decline as the film progresses. So it's almost like a reverse trajectory. We see these characters meet and sort of traverse through the story. But where was I going? Overall, it's a fantastic film, and it sort of feels a little bit like Great Gatsby-esque, but more grounded in really not being held back by any sort of studio interference from, like not letting it go all in, because it's a pretty graphic film in terms of the subjectivity, and there's a lot of sex and orgies and all kinds of shit that you see throughout the film. And I say Great Gatsby in the reference of, like, Great Gatsby is also a film that shows, like, the 1920s and partying and all things like that. So overall, Babylon was amazing. I loved it. I'd say it's probably, I don't know if I like it as much as La La Land, but I like this film in its own way. And I definitely suggest you check it out. It is a long movie, but I feel like they paced it very, very well. And for me, the highlight would probably be the writing. I love the writing. So that comes into number 3. Let's get into the number 2. Number 2, The Northman, directed by Robert Eggers. Huge fan of Robert Eggers. The Lighthouse is one of the few films that actually, after watching that and after experiencing that film, I'd always wanted to be an actor, but that was the film that really kind of inspired me and got me off my ass, and it made me kind of have the epiphany of, like, this is what I need to do. I want to be a storyteller. I want to be a performer. So that has been a very influential film in my life, and I love The Witch. I think that's one of the best horror films in the last 5 years, and I was excited for this. I'm not particularly a huge fan of Viking content, but of course it's Robert Eggers, so I thought I'd give it a shot, and I absolutely love this. This is a revenge tale. Alexander Skarsgård's character, a family member of his, gets killed early in the film, and from there, we see him as he's getting older. His whole life, his whole purpose from that point forward is to train, become strong, become mighty, and reclaim vengeance and take down the person that killed his father. I'll just say it. It's not a spoiler. I think the trailers make that very clear. And Alexander Skarsgård was incredible. Anya Taylor-Joy was great. And they also delve into some, mythology and stuff like that. and I loved it. And it's in the third act, the climax, when we get the inevitable fight between the character that killed Alexander Skarsgård's father and then himself, is just amazing. But yeah, and for me, the highlight would probably be Alexander Skarsgård. He was amazing. So let's go into the best film, or at least in my opinion, the best film of 2022. If you've watched me on any capacity on this channel, you probably already know what the answer is to that, but let's roll it. So number 1, the film that I think is the best movie of the year. That goes to Matt Reeves' The Batman. What can I say? There really is not much that I haven't already said. For a character that has had so many incarnations and different actors and different filmmakers taking a crack at it, Matt Reeves brought such a different approach and did something that nobody expected, and it was just absolutely amazing. Batman, of course, is a detective, and we've seen elements from the other films, like we've seen elements from the Nolan films of that detective side of Batman, but Matt Reeves made a clear choice to go deep down that lane and have that as an inherent part of the story, while still having the action and the fights and all that, but delving deep into the detective side of the character that hasn't really been fleshed out and that hasn't really been explored on film. So I loved it. I love Robert Pattinson's performance. It really grounds the character in the fact that you can tell he has that trauma and that it still lingers, and he doesn't just have this instant personality switch when he's in public. He's not that playboy Bruce Wayne that we've seen in the other films. And Nolan's films were definitely grounded and realistic, but I thought for someone that has dealt with so much trauma, like I get a lot of people put on a mask in public, but that part seemed a little unrealistic, that Bruce Wayne would just switch identities so quickly and so fluently. Whereas in this film, he's Batman all the time. And this is an early version of Batman, but Matt Reeves has discussed how this version of Batman doesn't know anything else but Batman. That's who he is. He doesn't want to be the public figure that we've seen in the other incarnations. He's not there yet. I'm sure we'll probably get that more, but he's just addicted to essentially using his trauma and his anger towards crime and how that obviously how that took out his parents, and using it in a sort of vigilante way, and going out and inflicting that harm and that trauma that was caused to him and putting that against other criminals. So, and this is the first Batman film that we'd had in a while that didn't show the origin, because we know what happens. We don't need to see it again. And Paul Dano was incredible as the Riddler. Obviously, a lot of parallels to the Zodiac Killer, and I can't wait for the next one. I'm hoping that with James Gunn building the new cinematic universe, I hope that this version of Batman could just be the exception. If I'm being a little bit selfish here, but I think a lot of people will probably agree with me in that regard. So, guys, that is it. Oh, my highlight for this film? The cinematography. What Greg Fraser did was incredible. Even on the scenes that were filmed on a soundstage, you could not tell unless you knew they were shooting on a soundstage. And there's other things I think the soundtrack was amazing. The theme, the actual Batman theme, that first scene when we see the Batman coming out of the shadows, we hear the heavy stomps of his feet. And of course it's raining, so you hear the sound of the water. So this film was amazing. I don't have a single gripe with it at all. So The Batman is number 1. That is my list in its entirety. This took forever, but I had fun doing it. I can't wait to do it again next year. If you stuck around for this long, I want to thank you for watching. What is your list of all the films you've watched that have come out in 2022? Very soon, I will have my list of the most anticipated films for me going into 2023. Guys, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you on the next podcast. Stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you on the next one.